Hello. Welcome to History Chats this afternoon. This is a bit of a pre-recorded. This is going to be pre-recorded, as when we are going live at our usual time at 12:30, it'll be pretty close to when we would be having a ceremony to receive an award. What award? Well, the one we're talking about today. So this is the Reuben Gold Thwaites Award. Thwaites? I've heard it said a few different ways. I guess I should, address this right away. I apologize if I'm going to be pronouncing it wrong. If there is a correct way, I've heard Thwaites, so I'm going to say Thwaites. But Reuben Gold Thwaites, the guy on the right there, important figure in Wisconsin history. And there's an award that is named after him, which is each year given out by the state of Wisconsin, the Historical Society, the state of Wisconsin, to the local institution or organization that displays the most outstanding efforts in the preservation, collection, and education of the history of the local communities. It's given out every year. It's a traveling trophy. It's not the first time that we've won this, but here we are. We won it. So we get it in 2023. We applied earlier, I think last year. I think it's end of last year, and then they decided it here. As I say, it's not the first time we've awarded it though. We've actually had this will be the third time that we've received the trophy. So we have 1958 and in 1989. I guess I can go full screen here. So this is the certificate here from 1958. The trophy itself travels, of course, so we will have it for a year as we did in the past, but then it goes on to the next person. And then here is 1989. Yeah. So we do have the certificates still. It's an honor, obviously, to be recognized for the work that we do, yeah. I think it's also worth noting that, getting the award is very cool. Where does it come from? Well, this is from the Wisconsin Journal Magazine of History. There was a section, and they called in the 50s the Circuit Rider, which is basically here's what's happening in Wisconsin, sort of the local level and things like that, what the organization of the State Historical Society is doing and its affiliations. They note that as part of their attempts to try to recognize and foster local history, that the Board of Curators decided to establish a rotating prize, which they've called the Reuben Gold Thwaites Trophy, which would be given out to the most outstanding local historical society in the state each year. And then they described it, it's gold mounted on a dark wood base with space on the plaque for the yearly edition of a name of a society which wins it. So this is it's an honorary sort of thing. It's not like there's not a cash prize as far as I know, but it is sort of an honor and recognition of the work that we do for local history, which is very cool. And of course, like I said, in 1958 they decided at that first meeting to vote to approve the nomination of the Marathon County Historical Society because of its outstanding work in taking history to the school children and the people of its area. So we get the trophy. Yeah, very cool. Then again, there's a 25-year wait, so you can't immediately nominate be nominated again in the following year. You have to wait for 25 years. And then there are criteria that you have to submit to show that you are doing the work that lives up to the ideals and sort of the expectations of a nominee for 5 years. So there's about 20 to 30 years that you have to kind of wait in order to be nominated again. So very cool, right? Well, who is Reuben Gold Thwaites, and why do we have an award named after him? This is a really interesting part of this too that I didn't necessarily know. I'm going to say before I get too far into it, there's a lot of great resources out there that have been written about Reuben Gold Thwaites and his legacy and his works during his time. I'm going to be largely using this as a document by Frederick Jackson Turner is put together as a memorial address. Reuben Gold Thwaites died in Thwaites died in 1914, about, I think, like a day before the annual meeting of the State Historical Society, which is, a big loss, of course. And so, Frederick Jackson Turner, another, very influential American historian based in Wisconsin, friend and colleague of the late Reuben Gold Thwaites, puts together a story of his life, which is about 100 pages. Don't need to read it. I read it all already, so you don't have to. But yeah, very, very great thing. Like I said, there's a lot of stuff that's been written about him, but this one in particular I thought was worth mentioning as a source for a lot of this. I'm going to be quoting pretty extensively from Frederick Jackson Turner over the course of this, so that's where it comes from. So I should say, Reuben was born to parents, immigrant parents from England. He was born in Dorchester, Massachusetts, and the family around when he was 13 moved to Wisconsin. They live on a farm outside of Oshkosh and Omro, and on that farm, he grows up. He gets probably an education at the local school system or whatever, one of them schoolhouses, and then he ends up, as a teenager and young adult working on the farm. He starts to actually teach school himself. Again, probably as like a one-room schoolhouse or like a graded situation, but probably not graded school at that point. And he also starts to, on the side, start to contribute to the Oshkosh Times, the local newspaper of the region of note. He's also starting to take some classes, studying college courses. He's not necessarily like taking correspondence classes. It's probably worded incorrectly here. He's not like taking credit, right? But he's starting to study the materials that you would need at a university level. And this culminates in him spending, I think, a year, maybe a year and a half, a little unclear, but at Yale University, where he studied, he took some graduate classes in, let's see, English literature, economic history, and international law. So nice spread of subjects there. He never graduates, though, and I don't know that he was ever intending to. It's a little unclear, and ultimately not super important. But he does not graduate. He does not get a degree. Later, I believe he will be given a doctorate as an honorary thing, I think, from the state of Wisconsin, University of Wisconsin. But I could be wrong about who gives that to him. But he does eventually, is Dr. Reuben Gold Thwaites. He moves back to Wisconsin, though, after a year in Yale. He goes to Madison, where he ends up getting a job as an editor for the Wisconsin State Journal. And of course, he's not just writing, the day-to-day stuff here. I'm not sure exactly what the nature of his contributions were to the State Journal, but I know he was also doing Wisconsin news as like a correspondent for Eastern newspapers out east, as well as doing some other stuff too. But certainly, he is a journalist, and he is capable, as we will see over the course of his life, of churning out a lot of work. He's an extent. I don't know how he has enough time in his life to have done as much writing as he did. And so this fast-paced world of journalism appears to have suited him pretty well. Again, Frederick Jackson Turner, in his memorial of him, notes that there's a grind, the churning of get stuff out quick. The news cycle is pretty quick, and you have to write a lot. But Reuben Gold Thwaites escapes from that, not scarred by the experience. He thrives in it. On the side, he also just writes some histories. And when I say writes, he's not just like summing up a history, like, hey, reword these things or pull together these sources. He's churning through the archives and really doing some formative work. There's not a lot of history that's written about, for example, at this point, the Oshkosh himself, the last of the Menominee Sachem, is published in 1976. And he follows this up with a history of the Winnebago County, just the county. Nobody had really done this yet. Nobody had in 1877 written a history of the county, in part because people probably didn't think there was much to write about. It's still pretty new. It's like, the last generation or two that really comes into what it is, but he sees the need to write that history. And so he pulls out those resources and he writes about it. In doing this, it's going to be the start of a lot of historical publication that he will do over the course of his life. But it's notable because in the 1870s, then he comes into contact with this guy, Dr. Lyman Draper, who was the first secretary and superintendent for the State Historical Society of Wisconsin. Basically from its founding in 1854 through 1887 when he finally steps down and retires. It's a long stretch of time and it's formative. Like he sets the foundation onto which a lot of the historical pursuits, not just at the State Historical Society, but as we'll see, the state is a great trunk through which the branches and root networks of the state historical societies all across the state are able to depend. And that's largely thanks to him, making sure the foundation was right. When he meets this young journalist named Reuben Gold Thwaites, he recognizes in him almost immediately that's going to be the guy that replaces me, and so he starts to foster that. Pretty soon, he convinces Reuben to become. I think his title was something like assistant corresponding secretary, which is sort of getting him ready and familiar with the workings of the organization. And when he steps down in 1887, it will be Reuben Gold Thwaites who takes over the job. Again, Frederick Jackson Turner says of him that if Draper was the founder, the guy who takes the historical society from nothing and gives it the firm foundation onto which to build, it's going to be Reuben Gold Thwaites who is the modernizer. He's going to build on top of it, and he calls him the great historical editor and modernizer. So we can talk about these in turn, but I think it's also worth noting that his motto apparently was, "We aim to be useful." And I don't know if this is something that he said a lot, or I honestly saw a quote that said that it was his motto, and I'll take it on face level. I think that there is something to this, though. Reuben Gold Thwaites is not the sort of historian or writer who is going to sit back and say, "Great, let's get all of this research or research material and primary stuff, and we'll just put it in a box on a shelf somewhere and make sure nothing happens to it." He wants to actively give access. He realizes pretty soon. Frederick Jackson Turner kind of jokes about how he discovered for the first time upon taking being in charge that, wow, a lot of students take advantage of the library here. It's something that he kind of knew already, but he recognizes that makes this sort of recognition that, hey, we need to create a better system. Students are the ones who are from the university are the ones who are making most use of the library at the State Historical Society, and so let's try to figure out ways to facilitate that, to make that process smoother so that they can get access to the research material, because there's no point in just holding on to this stuff if nobody's going to use it, which I think is very, very clearly, something that it's a good recognition, right? The Historical Society isn't just, it is funded by the state of Wisconsin. It's part of the state of Wisconsin in a sense. And so, whereas Draper, I think, was getting a little jaded, having to deal with the politicians, and started to say, like, maybe we should find some other revenue sources to make sure that, like, get an endowment and donations and private sources. We don't want to have to depend on the politicians. Reuben Gold Thwaites recognizes that, like, no, we have, he does that too. But he also recognizes that this relationship with the state of Wisconsin is really unique and strong. It's an amazing opportunity. We want to be useful. We want to just, not be a liability. We want to be something that is going to be out in the public and be useful to the state of Wisconsin. It's very sort of like early articulation of the Wisconsin idea, right? The other bit here about historical editor is interesting. So this, I just started by just pulling up some individual, again, this is from Frederick Jackson Turner's biography of him. Actually, let me pull up the full thing here. So it's on the Internet Archives. This is where I found this. So you can see these pages, this is just his list. There's 127 entries that I found. And it just goes on and on. And, of the like 90 some pages that exists here, I think a good 30 of them are just dedicated to his bibliography, the stuff that he contributes. Some of these things are going to be, one-off books here and there, articles. Some of them are series. A great example of this being, if I can pull here. So let me go full screen. So these books back here, we had them, they were sitting on the top shelf of the research library here at the Woodson History Center. And for years, I always thought that, let's see, is it going to focus? There we go. We get the idea. Wisconsin Historical Collections. This is volume 20. It's published by the State Historical Society and by Reuben Gold Thwaites. And I always thought like, oh, this is like the list, the index of the collections in the archives. No, actually what it is I mean, it is kind of that to an extent, but it's also a republishing of the letters. It's a summation. It's telling a story. This is not just meant to be a resource for like, do we have this or not, at a time before like internet indexes existed, PDFs and such. This is intended to be a resource in a grander scale. And I think that is something that it may be partially a thing of a bygone era. We don't see this in the same way. But it reflects his attempts, like this sort of editing. He wasn't just a historical writer, he was a historical editor. He did publish books, for example, The Story of Wisconsin. He wrote one of the first, histories of the state of Wisconsin. And he does this in a way that isn't quite so intellectual, scholarly. It is that, but he's also a really good writer. And I'll say that for my part, I'm both frustrated and also deeply indebted to him because in doing my research for the city of Wausa's 150th anniversary, the sesquicentennial last year, I did a program and I looked in his book and I was there's one passage where he even mentions Wausa or Marathon County, and that is to lump us in with a bunch of other lumber towns, which he describes as, quote, typical lumber towns, alive with the bustle of the world and conscious of a brilliant future. And I thought, on one hand, oh man, that's a little disappointing that he doesn't, elaborate. But I guess 1890, it's still pretty early for this area. We haven't quite come into our own in the importance. But at least it's a good bit of writing. So I definitely stole that, and so the name of my program on the history of Wausa was "Conscious of a Brilliant Future." So I took that from him. So he could write some. He wasn't just an editor. He also did write pretty extensively some histories. He knew how to do that too. But he also did discover, in process of understanding, what does the state of Wisconsin have, he also became familiar with other libraries, and he found some really interesting things. Primarily, a lot of the stuff that he published was like the Jesuit journals of the early sort of explorers and accounts here. But he also rediscovers the journals of Lewis and Clark. Those two figureheads of an expedition that was sent out to survey the Louisiana Purchase, right? And they came back and they gave their, here's a report, and all great, great. But then all of the materials, all those journals just went into an archive someplace, and people kind of forgot that they existed. They didn't realize what was here. And so he encounters this and says, oh, this is amazing. We need to republish this. And he does. He republishes them. Again, taking letters that are like handwritten and putting them into type so that they're easier to read and more accessible, I think it's hard to overstate the importance of that and making this accessible to the public. Because it wasn't just like the literal like, the report is pretty dry, cut and dry. It's like, this is here. And he realizes, no, the day-to-day experience of this is just enthralling, right? So let's make that possible for people to see. And in a sense, people had kind of forgotten and didn't realize this story, but in part thanks to Reuben Gold Thwaites, uncovering this, we were able to become part of the American consciousness of what that era was like. That was a big part of it too. I think he recognized that era of explorers and pioneers, like that wasn't that long ago from his contemporaries, maybe his parents, grandparents' generation, but those people were dying off. And those stories are being forgotten. And so it was sort of a recognition of like, this is an area of scholarship that needs attending to. And that was a big passion of his. Not just from an academic sense of here's what happened, but also, he went out and did it himself, right? So he didn't just write the history of the Ohio River. He went and he boated down the Ohio River. so that he could kind of see for himself and get an experience of it. That was the sort of person he was. He wasn't just sort of like, this is what the history was. He wanted to go and see the people and walk in there, or, maybe paddle down their shoes. I don't know if that metaphor continues, but you get the idea, right? He was hands-on in that regard. I'm going to put this in here. I know it's a lot of text, but I think this is also interesting. This is from Frederick Jackson Turner. He wasn't just also, overseeing the State Historical Society and, publishing, the Jesuit journals and the journals of, Clark, Lewis and Clark. He was also writing specifically to try and get this all material to the public. So he issued circulars of instructions on the mode of organizing local historical societies, collecting materials, and building up historical museums. He gave his hearty encouragement and cooperation to the modernizing of the museum into a valuable educational agency of the state. Now helping in person to form a local historical society. Now giving an address at a dedication of some monument or the marking of some trail, and illuminating the annuals of the locality by his own acquaintance with the antiquities and by his wider knowledge of the history of the state, of which his own history was a fragment. Its own history was a fragment. He strengthened in the localities the historical sense. In the genuine Wisconsin spirit, he made the society's activities coextensive with the state. So what he's saying here is, he didn't just sit in Madison and go, I got the history here. He was out and about. He was trying to make sure that people were getting interested in history. He was helping wherever he could to form historical societies, make museums relevant to the people that the stories they were trying to tell, and getting people interested in an interesting way. And he did this by getting out there and helping, by making circulars, by making syllabuses so that teachers of the high schools or elementary or education could teach local history. They could teach Wisconsin history. It's not just about those pioneer, the founders, the powdered wigs and the Revolutionary War. No, there's history here in the Midwest, in Wisconsin, and we can recognize it. And if that consciousness of making people aware, primed them to say, hey, we should save this stuff and we should document our own history, which I think is super, super important. And he wasn't just somebody who was, doing it here. He was recognized as, he was a head of the AHA, the American Historical Association. I think that's the acronym, or what the acronym stands for, but, professional organizations. He was the president. This is at their meeting in, I think, 1904 or 1906 in St. Louis. Yeah. And I guess to sum up here, Frederick Jackson Turner sums up, his late friend and colleague by saying that in the years to come, on the basis of the structure that Draper and Thwaites reared, this society will become increasingly the home of historical students. Here are the priceless materials of the history of that vast Middle West, whose ideals are shaping the nation. To understand the economic, political, and social development that followed the era of the explorer and pioneer requires the work of many students and will extend into later generations. Other men who will succeed Dr. Thwaites' office, and if they do their full duty, mindful of his example, they will open new avenues of progress to this society and will explore new fields of history. I think this is very prescient. Public history wasn't a thing at this point in the, understanding what this was, but he was doing public history. He was a public historian and fostering it, and sometimes it takes a few generations, but I think, if Draper laid the, foundation, made sure that the ground was level and that we could build a historical society, started to put the foundation in, Reuben Gold Thwaites makes sure that the early, plan for what's to come is broad enough to be expanded, to facilitate the history that is going to be important. To him, the history of those explorers and pioneers was desperately important to capture because we wanted to make sure that, hey, this is history that we have here, the Midwest, the Lewis and Clark, the Jesuit journals, the history, the early sense, that's stuff that we need to make sure is there. But he also recognized, I think, that in the future, students are going to bring their own generational understanding and the things that we are going to need to be able to do as historical societies as a general concept and locally here in Wisconsin will need to be reactive. It'll need to be flexible enough so that we can tell those stories that are important for future generations. And I think for that, I don't know. I think it makes a lot of sense then that he becomes the namesake for, the award for local history, because he is the guy who recognizes its importance and does more than anybody else, arguably. I mean, granted, he's the head. I don't want to say that it was just him, because I think it was definitely a movement in a larger scale. But he certainly is this singular figure that makes it possible. I think, if nothing else, I'll say this: I think that he is the sort of local historian that we try to aspire. At least I see in him a lot of the things that I try to do, right? To be knowledgeable and be able to be in the public, and to educate and get people interested in history, and to allow other people to tell stories. And I think that is what we all, aspire to try to do. So they name a trophy after him. And that trophy then comes to us in 1958. I cut this, but I'll just note that also in 1958, there had been the institute that we did. You know what? Actually, I'm gonna put it back in. Screw it. I cut it for time, but I'm gonna put it back in to eat some up. Unhide. Let's put it here. So in 1958, we actually hosted what was the first sort of essentially conference outside of Madison. John Stautenberg the previous year had been down in Madison for the Institute get together, and he said, it's kind of far away for people to travel down to Madison. Have you considered doing one a little bit further north so that more people can access? And so there's sort of an off-season, sort of regional one that happens, and we sponsor it here in Marathon County. And I think, it was a good opportunity to show that, hey, we got some good stuff going on here. We're taking part in that larger issues. And I think Stautenberg, deservedly so, was seen as being in the footsteps of Reuben Gold Thwaites in an important way. Yeah, so that's kind of cool. And maybe in part, that is one of the reasons that informed the decision to give it to us as the first recipient. But it did then pass on to the Menasha Historical Society in 1959. I'll note, I think they changed the trophy itself. I could be wrong about this. I can't find anything specific, but I noticed this weekend as I was putting this together, like, oh, this trophy is different than this one. And it could be a trick of the light. The photography, this is obviously not the best image here, but I think they maybe made it from more of a cup to being more of a bowl, to be maybe more reflexive for the sort of award that they wanted it to be. But anyway, it has essentially been the same ever since, as far as I can see. It's passed on to other historical societies near and far over the years, until in 1989 it eventually comes back to Wausau. This is, I'm not sure exactly where this is. I'm guessing the Wausau Club. Tom Schleif, of course, the director at that point in time, holding the award, does a lot, again, sort of innovative ways. His passion project of organizing Logjam and, things like that, certainly deserved recognition in that regard. It's interesting to think 1989, because that's before, we were not in this building that I'm recording, the Woodson History Center. We didn't own this yet. We were still all over in the Yawkey House. We hadn't restored that to be what it was. But still, I think deservedly so for that point in time. Anyway, these are the winners over the years, the list so far. Most of these are not multiple-time winners, although there are a few. We're the only historical society, Marathon County, to win it 3 times. This will be the 3rd time. A number of other historical societies have won it twice. So Milwaukee County, Dunn County, Rock County, Fort Atkinson, Ripon County, Chippewa Valley Museum, the Bayview Historical Society, and Manitowoc County Historical Society are the ones that have won it twice. But also a lot of representation from other parts of the state as well in different regards. All of these institutions are worth seeing. They all are great, as well as many others that maybe just haven't applied, But I think we're in good company, I guess is what I'll say there. And again, at some point after this year is over, the award will travel on to another deserving institution, and we can celebrate their contributions as well. So yeah, it's a fun opportunity to talk about, I think, an important part. I hope this isn't too self-indulgent to talk about the process of local history, but it's something I think about a lot. And I think, maybe we should. Hopefully this has been interesting. I think Reuben Gold Thwaites is just an interesting character in general. So now you know the namesake of the trophy if you see that we get it. And hey, maybe stop by and see the trophy. I'm not sure how we're going to display it yet. We'll probably have it out in some capacity. But hey, yeah, if you cop by and you see the trophy here, or maybe in the future you're seeing somewhere else, you'll know the story behind the man and the trophy. And I'll say, to sum up, this is obviously I think I said an honor to receiving the award here in 2023. I will say also that it's great opportunity to being recognized for the work that we do here as staff at the Historical Society. Also, all of our board members, our volunteers, our members that make it possible. Is because I mean, like, it, I can sit here and do these programs, but if nobody watches, then what's the point, right? It's really the people that are engaged with history at a local level here in Marathon County that make it possible for us to do this. So I guess what I'm saying is thank you for watching, right? Because it's the interest in history and the stories that we tell that make it possible for us to keep telling them. So getting the award is a great opportunity to sort of pat ourselves on the back and recognize the work that we do. But we will hopefully, regardless of whether we got the award or not, we will continue to do our best to share local history and keep people interested as we go forward. So yeah, thanks for watching. I don't know, we'll be back with a live program next week. We're going to be talking about some art stories as we get into that particular season of the year, the Arts Fest and things like that. But more on that soon. For now, I'll call it here and say thanks for watching, and we will see you next time.